Hey. It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. Listen, I am so glad you're here. I am incredibly grateful for those of you who have joined the Empathy 14. My goal is that after this inaugural year, that every year, August 1st through the 14th, that I will be gracious enough to warrant the love and concern and care of all of you to join me each year in our efforts to build more empathy. Um, Today, the fourth is about feedback. And I don't know if you know this, but if you tell somebody, would you like my feedback? The same neurons that fire in the brain when someone has a gun pointed to your head are the same ones that fire when someone says, hey, let me give you some feedback. People want feedback, but they absolutely do not like to get it. And some of you know that I started my engineering career at Hallmark Cards, but I want to just be super clear. It's been over a decade since I've worked there, so I'm not talking about the company in a current sense. I'm talking about circa 1998, so like 25 years ago. So keep that in your mind. I'm not talking about anybody who works there now, or I don't know anything about the culture. They're not a client, none of those things. But when I got to Hallmark in 1998, there were people who were working on diversity, equity, and inclusion plans. In fact, there were employee resource groups based on race. There were employee resource groups based on sexual orientation and gender. And you could see those employee resource groups in marketing. You could see them in operations, IT. We were the women of operations, even, I remember. And so I know I'm biased, right? I think sometimes people don't like to admit that they're biased about things, but I'm biased. I grew up in a space where the person running all things supply chain, purchasing, manufacturing, distribution, warehousing, everything was a Black man named Ray Powers. And he was one of the most powerful people in the organization, at least based on how I saw it. If Ray didn't do his job, not one card could get out each day. And I remember pushing us at the time that we needed to do more because there was Ray ended up being a corporate officer, but at the time I think there were like 9 and only one was a person of color and there were no women. And I was pushing to say that we needed more of that. I got to meet the likes of James C., who was a senior manager when he was 25 years old. He's a Black man who was leading pretty much all things people related for Crown Center. And if you're not from the Kansas City area, it's a shopping center. There's ice skating rinks, food and entertainment and hotels, and Union Station is in Crown Center. There's lofts and condominiums. Just to me, a beautiful place to be. And when I grew up, well, none at Crown Center, but Kaleidoscope, and it was dilapidated. There was a manufacturing facility down there. And I happened to be at Hallmark when that manufacturing facility closed, and then they moved those operations out to the Leavenworth production facility where I worked. And so I grew up in a space where, Ray started in the 70s. Mr. Powers started in the 70s. Folks were talking about race equity in the corporation where I was in the 70s. It was nothing during Black History Month for Hallmark to share the history of race and racism of the organization. They would share that, hey, the first Black person who ever worked here was a man who worked in the cafeteria. They would show the picture of him in the sea of white. They would talk about the cards that used to have blackface on them and have negative connotations. Those things did not make me feel worse about Hallmark Cards. The fact that Hallmark was willing to acknowledge that there was a problem made me feel better about Hallmark Cards. And when I left in 2012, I asked Don Hall for a meeting. He was the chairman and CEO at the time. And I was happy if I could get 15 minutes. That man talked to me for 3 hours, allowing me to give him feedback. This family been on the billionaire list for at least 5 decades. He ain't got to listen to me. He don't have to give me no time on his schedule. I'm grateful for the time because he demonstrated to me what receiving feedback looks like. To not to not be upset and frustrated when you could when you hear somebody tell you about the underbelly of whatever it is you got going on. You see, because 100% of people have something good about them and something bad about them, which means organizations have the same thing. And the work that I have to do is to be more open to feedback. So, which takes me to what I want to talk about today. Joy Reid was asked, did she feel solemn because of Donald Trump's indictments? And Joy said, you know, January 6, 2021 was 2 years ago. And we are just now seeing a semblance of justice. I went live on a Wednesday, and I think there's only been 2 times I've gone live on a Wednesday. That was one of the times I went live on a Wednesday. And I went live specifically because I could not believe what I was seeing. And I know that if I get to live to be an old woman, that somebody is going to ask me about that day. Because there were people scaling walls, screaming, defecating inside federal property. Okay? Walking into places, beating up police, of whom we know some have died. And the man lost. His people told him he lost. And so when I contrast all of that, and that on that Wednesday, that Filter-Free Friday, I said, I'm just trying to imagine what it would look like if these were Black bodies doing this. Because there is no way. And I am persistently in conversations with people who want to push it back to the personal and say, well, if we didn't believe that certain things, that somehow this racism thing would just go away. And I'm like, we have built it into the fabric of everything, so much so that someone can listen, y'all. Literally, I'm not talking figuratively, literally pulling down their pants, defecating inside federal property, feet on desk. It took years for something to happen to those people. And when you consider Kalief Browder, if you don't know who he is, he was a 16-year-old child, Black child, who was accused of stealing a backpack. And Kalief Browder was sent to Rikers Island. He spent 3 years waiting for someone to give him a trial, to either find him guilty or innocent. 2 of those years while he was in Rikers Island, he was in solitary confinement. The baby was 16 years old. Brutalized amongst men for the accusation of stealing a backpack. And what happened to Kalief Browder was so disruptive to his life that he took his own life. That story sticks with me because the people who say, I just don't, do we need these diversity and inclusion efforts? These, I try to treat people based on who they are. I mean, have you heard this before? So I want to share with you why it is important for us to continue always to give feedback, because if you don't give feedback, then people will just continue to act like, you know what, this, I don't know what you're talking about, but this ain't how it happened. Because folks trying to act like that this insurrection was not what we all sat and watched, and empathy cannot sit on a bed of lies. Watch with me for just, give me 15, 20 seconds.
Do you believe that your bank benefited from slavery in some way in terms of its business practices? If so, raise your hand. If you do not believe that it benefited, raise your hand. Let the record reflect that all but Mr. Diamond raised a hand. Thank you. let's move on.
Yeah, let's move on, because this was at the same hearing where J.P. Morgan had acknowledged in a 2005 report that they built their bank off the backs of selling enslaved people and giving loans on them. In this same hearing, J.P. Morgan says the reason why we've got an opportunity to be able to have a bank public record is because we sold securities based on enslaved people. Now, J.P. Morgan helping all them other banks. And so when you consider that in the Fortune 500, not even 2% of the top CEOs are Black. In K through 12 public education in the city, in the 15,000 public school districts in this country, 83% of the superintendents happen to be white. When you look across almost, it doesn't matter what the leadership area is, we ain't there. And so the power structure is that you have people who know that they bought and sold securities off the backs of enslaved people. When asked, did their banks benefit from slavery? Hands down. But we can manage in curriculum to say that slavery benefited Black people. So I decided, you know what? Let me lean into that. Let me tell you how slavery benefited Black people. You got 100% of Black enslaved women who are now survivors of rape and sexual assault. Survival is a benefit. We could have died. You've got 100% of Black families that were separated and spread all over. And you know what the benefit is? We learned how to locate our families. We benefited. You know what else? How else I think we possibly have benefited? You know, the ability to take a scripture and theology and entire divine systems that have been orchestrated to keep you enslaved and turn them into something that is a metamorphosis of that, something that is still to this day a source of empowerment and inspiration. That's innovation. We learned some innovation. But what we're not going to do, you see, feedback is giving and receiving. So we have to talk about what banking and lending institutions gained from the institution of slavery. Because that hearing that I was showing you, they were having to account for the subprime mortgage crisis that happened in 2008. And they were having to account for what happened there. You see, and sometimes I lack empathy. I lack the ability to understand what kind of pathology would have you say, you know what, I'm going to sell subprime mortgage loans to people who don't deserve them, who don't need them, who qualify for much better. And I'm going to target Black people because nobody really care about them. And I don't care if the entire nation falls down on because of it. What kind of pathology causes that? I can tell you what kind of pathology causes that. It is the benefiting off of the rape, pillage, and terror of Black people for centuries. You see, because that was a benefit. What kind of benefit is it to you to sit and watch other people treat humans like cattle? What does that do? That builds a level of cognitive dissonance that makes it possible for you to be able to be so greedy that you have no integrity and no ethics. You see, that's a benefit to you. And when you look at the people who were sitting in that hearing, all of them look the same way. All of them were about the same age. And all of them think that there was no benefit to them. And that is what we are up against, my loves. And so while I do know with everything in my being that feedback gets you fired, here's what I'll tell you. Whenever I ain't holding you accountable to what I say, I'm only going to hold you accountable to what you say. And every single last one of those CEOs said they value diversity and inclusion at the start of that hearing. But when asked, how many of you expect for your successor to be a person of color or a woman? Not a single one raised their hand. When asked, how many of you think in 10 years do you think that you'd have a woman or a person of color raise their hand? Not a single one raised their hand. And so when I consider these systems of disparity, see, you can't look at me and say, well, Nicole, if you were just a little more mindful. No. When people tell me, Nicole, I don't know why you're doing this empathy revolution. We don't need empathy. We need to be meaner. That's a person who does not understand what empathy is. See, you see, empathy has helped me to understand very clearly that when I understand the pathology of people who will in 1 second say, yeah, we put out an entire report that said that we sold people so that we could build the wealth of the bank. And then in less than a minute later say, I have no way. We ain't benefit from slavery. That's what we up against. And when you lack empathy, see, when you lack empathy, what you do is you say, I can't even imagine somebody doing that. So they wouldn't do that. And what I need you to understand, baby, is that some of y'all just as biased as I am. Them people that got the diversity, equity, and inclusion bug in 2020, it was just a bug. I remember Jim Nunnally called me. He said, hey, you better capitalize on this while you can. I said, sir, absolutely not. I'm not moved by greed. He was like, well, it's gonna run out quick. I know. Because here's what else I know. People who understand what diversity means know that you can't have two people working for your organization without having some difference present. Now, it might not be racial difference, but you got some difference present. People who understand what it means to build a 100-year organization understand that you have got to find a way for all of those people to be able to feel like they can show up every day and do their best work. What kind of business leader goes, for a certain percentage of my population, I don't care nothing about if I get the best out of them or not. You paying your money. It's terrible, terrible business ethics. In fact, I ain't even gonna call it business ethics. It's just bad business savvy. It might satisfy you for a little bit, but it ain't gonna satisfy you in the long run. And so when I consider people who go, well, I got to treat everybody the same, I say we terrible at that, but that is also horrible leadership. Good leaders know there's no way you can treat everybody the same. You treat people according to what they need to be able to get their jobs done. I am an extrovert through and through. Don't you dare try to allow me some reflection time. I don't need no reflection time to think about what I got to say. I know right away. But somebody else needs reflection time. They don't want you coming and just talking to them all the time. And they would appreciate if you would get them an agenda, and they need it. And please send it more than a day in ahead. That's equity, to give people what they need instead of treating people the same. And businesses that survive are the ones that understand that. And your lack of ethics and integrity might be okay in the short run. But if, my dears, we don't want people 200 years from now saying, I think Black folk benefited from that insurrection. I think Black folk benefited from having 83% of their superintendents be white. I think Black folks benefited from the subprime mortgage crisis. I believe that Black women in childbirth benefited from being the ones who died the most. If you don't want them saying that 200 years from now, lovelies, you better document that feedback and make it plain. Better speak up. I think it was Audre Lorde said something about, look, if you don't say nothing, they'll kill you and tell everybody you liked it. It's Filter Free Friday, y'all. Listen, we got plenty of work to do.